Chapter 1. Before the Gunshot. It was supposed to be a night of diplomacy and champagne, a glittering affair high above the rain-slicked streets of 1934 London. But by morning, one of Britain's most powerful men would lie dead, and every guest would have something to hide. The clouds had arrived long before the guests. Thick, hanging low over the chimneys and facades of Mayfair, they blurred the city's edges, casting the rooftops in shadow, while street lamps glowed like secrets trying not to be seen. Somewhere below, the city moved as it always had, rushed, resigned, half listening to the wireless, but above, in the glass-topped penthouse of Lord Malcolm Studholme, an entirely different world had begun to assemble. It was not a party for the masses, nor for the merely fashionable. This was a gathering of power, quiet, polished, carefully dressed power, the kind that makes or unmakes reputations with a raised eyebrow. Lord Studholme, whose newspapers had exposed the affairs of ministers and dismantled careers with single sentences, was hosting in honour of a foreign royal Princess Amelia of Corsica, a diplomatic overture dressed as an evening soirée. The guest list was limited, the wine imported, and the atmosphere poised, as if the room itself was waiting for something to happen. They arrived just after 8, stepping from their private cars and cabs, escorted by footmen who vanished into the storm before they could be seen clearly. Guy Kenyon, the secretary, young, polished, and harbouring a great many unread thoughts. Peggy Studholme, Malcolm's only daughter, elegant and decisive, already bracing for whatever mood her father had chosen to adopt that evening. Joan Holland, cheeks flushed from the cold or from nerves, one could not tell. Her father, Sir John Holland, followed closely behind her, his steps measured, his eyes already scanning the upper hall as though entering a crime scene yet to occur. Adrian Chidiot arrived late, as writers do, his coat still damp from the alley he preferred to walk through rather than the main road. His wife Anna apologised for him before he had even spoken. General Piddinghoe saluted no one, but took champagne as if it were medicine. Howard Vernon, whose presence was never explained, mingled as if he'd been invited by accident and stayed to prove it wasn't. The princess herself arrived last, fashionably so, in a velvet dress too heavy for the season, and a pistol tucked into her clutch for her own amusement, or perhaps to make a point. She smiled too often, drank too quickly, and did not sit when chairs were offered. She, like the others, had come not just to honour her host, but to be seen, heard, and above all remembered. But this night would not be remembered for the wine, nor for the imported oysters, nor even for the discreet string quartet who played pieces no one could name. It would be remembered for the game. At precisely 9:30, while lightning flashed over the rooftops and the windows trembled just slightly in their frames, Princess Amelia proposed a diversion. "Let us play murder," she said with a sly glance around the room. "Surely one among us has the imagination for it." There was laughter, muted, careful, the sort of laughter that checks the host's face before continuing. Studholme agreed. Of course he did. He found the idea theatrical, and had always believed games revealed more than conversation ever could. Slips of paper were distributed, one for the detective, one for the murderer, the rest, witnesses. The lights would go out. The murderer would find their victim and tap them on the shoulder. The detective would question them all until a conclusion was drawn. Harmless, of course, nothing more than a game. The lights went out. That was when everything changed. We don't begin with conclusions. That would be far too simple and too generous. We begin instead with absence, of light, of certainty, of knowing where anyone truly was in that moment. Footsteps shifted, voices whispered. Someone laughed nervously, too loudly. A chair scraped across the floor, followed by silence. Then a sound, sharp, immediate. Then another. When the lights returned, Lord Malcolm Studholme no longer moved. But this isn't where the story ends. It's where it truly begins. What followed was not simply the unravelling of a single evening, but the exposure of an entire architecture of secrets. Joan's letters, Guy's humiliation, Adrian's ruined reputation, Amelia's blocked loan. Every guest had something concealed in their coat pocket, in their expression, in the details of their past. Studholme had orchestrated a gathering in his own image, carefully controlled, powerfully staged, but what he had not predicted, or perhaps had, was that someone in that room would no longer play by his rules. The investigation would come later, the accusations, the courtroom, the testimony that shifted like the storm itself. But for now, let us linger in the moment just before all of that, before the questions were asked, before the stories changed, before the truth grew too uncomfortable to be spoken. Because the truth, as always, hides not in what is shouted, but in what is quietly avoided. Who drew their slip of paper with trembling fingers? Who knew the lights would go out and planned to act within that silence? Who whispered in the dark, thinking their words would never reach the light again? There is always one who sees what others miss, one who listens, even as the room pretends to forget, and one who acts, not out of impulse but necessity. This is not the story of a man's final moments. It is the story of how each guest arrived with more than baggage, of how power demands obedience until it demands silence, and how, once silence is broken, justice no longer knocks politely. You are about to enter that room. You are about to watch their faces as the game becomes real. And you must ask yourself, quietly, carefully, what would you do in the dark? The guest list, as was always the case with Lord Malcolm Studholme, had been curated not for compatibility, but for leverage. He invited people not because they were charming, but because they owed him something, or soon would. It was a party assembled like a chessboard, with every piece placed not for celebration, but for checkmate. The first to arrive had been Joan Holland, escorted though not guided by her father, Sir John. She looked over her shoulder too often, and when she smiled, it never quite reached her eyes. Her dress was modest, though tailored perfectly, her posture trained, and yet she moved as though trying not to disturb anything, not even the air. Studholme greeted her with a kiss to the hand, and a whisper too low for anyone else to hear. Her face fell half a shade. Whatever he had said, it was not meant to comfort her. Sir John, meanwhile, greeted the butler with the formality of a man used to entering difficult rooms. He wore the face of a man trained not to react. As Chief Inspector of Scotland Yard, now technically retired, he had seen many drawing rooms more dangerous than this one, but few as well dressed. Peggy Studholme was next, his daughter radiant in her silk and disapproval. She knew what this evening was meant to be, and what it threatened to become. Her movements were deliberate, her greetings polite, but there was an unmistakable steel behind her eyes. Her secret had already been revealed, her marriage to Guy, the secretary, and she was prepared, if needed, to defend it without raising her voice. Guy Kenyon arrived moments later, taking care to enter not with her, but behind her. Their union had been quiet, almost private, and Lord Studholme, who could accept nearly any scandal so long as it was someone else's, had taken personal offence. Guy's jaw was tight as he handed his coat to the butler. The look he gave Peggy was not one of love, but of strategy. He knew perhaps better than anyone just how delicate the ground beneath them had become. Adrian Chidiot did not knock. He swept in, already annoyed by the weather, the invitation and the wait. He'd once been praised in literary circles. Now he was quoted only when mocking himself. Studholme had written him off years ago with a review so brutal it had closed his last play and nearly bankrupted him. Adrian carried that memory like a bruise no one else could see, but it dictated his every move. His wife Anna, trailing behind him with apologies in her eyes, wore a shawl too thin for the weather. She would smile all evening and say little. General Piddinghoe, Vernon and the Baron arrived as a unit, older, broader and always half listening. They did not know why they had been summoned, but they understood that to be summoned by Studholme was never casual. He needed something from them, or knew something about them. That was the way it worked. And then the princess, Amelia of Korsova, entered as though she had been waiting all her life to make an entrance. Her dress, dark violet and trimmed with pearls, shimmered like oil beneath the lights. Her accent wandered from Paris to Prague to something entirely her own. She kissed both cheeks of every man she greeted, and said nothing that could be quoted, but everything that could be remembered. She placed her small clutch on the table, and from it pulled the toy pistol, silver, child-sized, absurdly ornate. For games, she said with a wink, should diplomacy fail. No one laughed. Or rather, they did, but no one meant it. By 8:10,
The champagne had been served, the staff dismissed to the lower floors, and the quartet had begun a waltz no one danced to. Studholme stood in the center of it all, collecting observations like others collected coats. He leaned in too close when speaking, let silences hang longer than necessary, and when he smiled, it was often at something he did not say. He pulled Joan aside within the hour, his hand resting lightly on her wrist, his voice barely audible. But whatever was said, whatever threats or reminders were exchanged, left her white at the knuckles. Peggy confronted him before dessert. "If you ruin him, you ruin me," she said quietly. He replied with a smile that said she had never quite understood the rules. "That," he answered, "has always been your mistake." The butler, already dismissed once for misplacing a monogrammed cigarette case, lingered longer than usual in the hallway, watching the guests with something approaching caution. He had seen evenings like this before. He knew what games were played under chandeliers, and in the corner, Adrian sipped brandy and watched the room as one watches a stage, half in admiration, half in disdain. "He's arranged us beautifully," he muttered. "We're all pieces in a play we didn't agree to perform." To which Anna said, softly, "You came anyway," and he replied, "Only because I still think the last line might be mine." It was then, perhaps just after the third toast, just before the second course, that Studholme raised his glass and declared, "Tonight we celebrate diplomacy." His words carried well. "But what is diplomacy?" he added, "without a little theatre?" And with that, he nodded toward the princess, who smiled, and reached for her toy pistol once more. The room paused. Briefly, unnoticeably, nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was. It began, as these things often do, with a suggestion made lightly, but heard heavily. The room had reached that moment in any gathering, when conversation circles back on itself, and the champagne begins to feel more like habit than indulgence. Princess Amelia, seated with one elbow resting elegantly on the back of a winged chair, tilted her head and said, "Let us play something delightfully English. That game with secrets, with accusation, with performance." Her voice, musical and dry, carried just enough amusement to make her proposal seem harmless. Lord Studholme raised an eyebrow, not because the idea surprised him, but because it didn't. "You mean murder," he said. "How fitting." There was a pause then, subtle but real, a half-second where each guest considered whether the evening would now take on a different shape. A parlor game, yes, but also a performance, one with its own rules and its own outcomes. Adrian Chidiat clapped his hands with theatrical glee. "Ah yes, slips of paper, one for the detective, one for the culprit, everyone else, innocent and terrified." He grinned, and for the first time all evening, the lines on his face looked genuinely alive. "I'll prepare the lots. If we are to play, let's not pretend, let us commit." Anna, seated beside him, said nothing. The lights were lowered, as they must be in such games. The butler was asked to leave the room entirely, which he did with unusual reluctance. The slips were distributed, a brief rustle of hands, smiles exchanged, some real, some worn like masks. The detective was unnamed, the culprit hidden among them, and the lights, with a dramatic flourish, went dark. Silence, then movement, a breath caught in someone's throat, a soft gasp, footsteps, no, shoes brushing over the carpet. Someone whispered a name, someone else replied, "Don't speak." There was a rustle near the dining table, then nothing again. Joan Holland, in the dark, reached for the nearest shoulder, desperate for orientation. "Please," she whispered, "I need to tell you before he—" But the shoulder was not Studholme's, it was her father's. Sir John, hearing her voice tremble in the dark, said nothing. He listened, as a detective would, as a father must. Elsewhere, Guy Kenyon stepped quietly toward the study. The rules of the game dictated he must find the host and deliver a theatrical tap, the make-believe murder. It was, of course, meant in jest, yet his fingers were clenched in his coat pocket. Adrian had not spoken since the game began. He had vanished, or simply faded into the dark. There were whispers of movement where he had been, then silence. His absence went unnoticed by most. Perhaps that was his plan. And the princess, her laughter broke the tension at one point, brief and high, as if amused by the drama or delighted to be at the center of it. Then, a sound, Not the soft pad of footsteps, not the creak of a chair, something sharper, a single unmistakable gunshot. Then, barely a breath later, a second, the lights returned. Lord Malcolm Studholme was slumped in his study chair, his chin tipped toward his chest, one arm hanging awkwardly over the side, his spectacles sat askew, his mouth was just slightly open. A moment passed before anyone moved. Joan stepped backward. Adrienne reappeared at the far end of the room, breathless, holding nothing. Peggy turned to look at her husband, who stood perfectly still, his hands visible, empty. The toy pistol, Amelia's, lay on the floor near the fireplace, ornamental and open, but no one reached for it. Everyone, it seemed, was suddenly aware that what had just occurred was no longer performance. Sir John moved first, not with the urgency of panic, but with the deliberate calm of a man trained to see the aftermath of secrets exposed. He crossed the room, knelt briefly, and rose again. His expression changed, not dramatically, but enough for Peggy to see it, and take half a step closer to the wall. 2 shots, he said. One, close, one, from a distance. Silence swallowed the room again. Amelia looked down at her empty glass. Well, she said, that certainly changes the rules. Inspector Romage arrived before midnight. By then, the penthouse had changed. The guests no longer spoke as guests. They answered only what was asked. The staff had been assembled in the servants' quarters. The game had been abandoned, and the room where the laughter had lived now echoed with accusation. Guy was questioned first. He had approached the study, admitted as much. He had motive, said the inspector, and opportunity, and perhaps a violent reaction to the threats he'd endured from the man now in the other room. But nothing was found on him. No weapon, no stain, only tension and silence. Joan's name surfaced next. The letters, the pressure, the fear in her voice before the lights had gone out, the whispers she thought no one heard. Adrienne laughed when accused, not dismissively, but bitterly. I wouldn't waste ink on him, let alone lead, he muttered. His words, however, carried weight. His hatred for Studholme was no secret. His career, many said, had been destroyed by one man's pen. Perhaps this was revenge. Sir John said little. His notes were made privately, his conclusions held close. He had retrieved the letters from Joan's coat pocket before anyone had searched her, burned them later, in the fire. He had not asked her permission. He did not need to. As for the princess, she offered her view with a shrug. A tragedy, she said. But I warned you, diplomacy is a performance. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. The evening had begun with crystal glasses, with laughter and low threats, but now the drawing room stood heavy with secrets. The scent of tobacco still lingered, but so did suspicion, and though everyone had returned to their chairs, no one sat as they had before. The game had ended, but the real performance had only just begun.
Chapter 2. Before the curtain rises. And so the lights returned, and silence wrapped the room with more precision than any orchestra ever could. Lord Studholme, moments earlier presiding like a man above consequence, now sat motionless in his chair. The glass near his right hand remained upright. Nothing else did. But before the questioning began, before the doubts were voiced aloud, before the whispers turned to statements, there is something else you must understand. Something essential. London, you see, was not merely a backdrop, it was a character. In 1934, it breathed with elegance and excess, but also with exhaustion. The scars of the Great War had not faded. They had merely been wallpapered over by roaring jazz and rolled cigars. There were new buildings, yes, and louder parties, but beneath the surface of high society lay a truth everyone recognized and none dared say. The veneer of progress was thin and papered with lies. This was a city of spectacle and secrets, where the powerful wrapped their corruption in gold leaf invitations and inked editorials. The Thames still rolled as it had always done, but it carried with it whispers of scandal, of betrayal, of revenge dressed in couture, and in this London no man held more influence or inspired more quiet resentment than Lord Malcolm Studholme. Newspapers were his weapon, and he wielded them not for journalism, but for power. He had built an empire from blackmail, disguised as reporting. his headlines a currency stronger than sterling. He could manipulate elections with a paragraph, ruin marriages with a column, and make fortunes vanish with a subheading. He did not own a printing press, he owned perception itself. One fictional but widely repeated quote, published in the Fleet Street Review just days before the party, read, "Studholme is not interested in the truth. He is interested in the story that survives it." That single sentence earned him a lawsuit, a record-breaking sale in circulation, and more quietly, an invitation to dine at the Foreign Office. That was his way. He did not ask permission. He declared relevance, and when he summoned people, be they writers, royals, barons, or daughters, they came. Not always willingly, but always. This, then, was the London of his design, where journalists were puppets, aristocrats were pawns, and the public played their part in ignorance. And now, in the very city he shaped with ink and threats, he had hosted a party, an evening filled not with friends, but with liabilities, with watchers, with debts, with faces that smiled through clenched jaws. What happened next would not be explained away by drink or darkness, because justice, when it arrives at such a height, tends to knock very, very softly. To understand the guests, one must first understand the cost of survival. London's elite had not emerged from the war untouched. They had simply learned how to conceal their bruises behind mahogany panels and floral stationery. Beneath the tuxedos and tiaras lived generations who had traded their sons for medals and their estates for relevance. They kept their voices low, not because they feared scandal, but because scandal had become currency. Every affair, every cover-up, every betrayal tucked neatly into gossip columns that Lord Studholme could expand or retract with a single call. Some said he held dossiers on half of Parliament, others whispered he was blackmailing a bishop, but no one ever challenged the accuracy of his information. The facts hardly mattered. What mattered was that he could create scandal, control its pace, and extinguish it on his terms. This was not journalism. This was manipulation at the highest level, and those who depended on public opinion, politicians, diplomats, society wives, feared him more than any courtroom. Even the aristocracy, ancient and brittle with pride, had come to accept that power no longer rested with the landed, but with the printed. And in that transformation, Studholme found his obsession. He was not interested in money for its own sake. He already had it. What he pursued was leverage. The slow, methodical exposure of secrets, timed like a maestro guiding an overture. His invitations were never invitations, they were summons. His parties were not hosted for pleasure, they were curated for control. Each guest at that gathering, each one, had something to protect. Some carried whispers of financial misconduct, others the memory of a forbidden affair that had once threatened a title. One man owed Studholme his career, another his silence, and at least one owed him their freedom. What united them was not loyalty, but fear, and among them sat the princess, a woman whose country had run out of credit with the British government, and whose political survival now rested on a loan Studholme was in a position to derail. Her presence at the party was less about diplomacy and more about desperation, yet she smiled as though nothing mattered, toying with her pistol as though she didn't understand what it meant to be disarmed. Studholme's gaze lingered on her too long. His words were polite, but in his tone lived an implication that her crown meant less than his front page. These were the stakes. This was not merely an elegant dinner in the clouds. This was a stage dressed as a drawing room, and while the wine flowed and the orchestra played, no one truly relaxed. They laughed, yes, but they listened. Every comment weighed, every nod observed, every silence noted, because in Studholme's world, information was always being gathered, and every conversation, no matter how trivial, might one day appear in the margins of a scandal that had yet to erupt. The guests had come dressed in silk, but some wore gilt like a second skin, and Studholme, as always, was watching. To be invited to one of Studholme's gatherings was not an honor, it was an obligation. Declining could raise suspicion. Accepting meant walking into a room without knowing whether you were the guest or the exhibit. He greeted each person, not with affection, but with calculation.
His eyes flicked, not with interest but with inventory. What leverage did this one carry? What weakness had that one acquired since their last encounter? His conversations were rarely remembered for their charm, but they were always remembered. That night, he made his rounds like a monarch with a private war to wage. Peggy, his daughter, received a nod and a veiled threat. Guy, her husband, his secretary, was served a reminder that marriage did not excuse ambition. Joan Holland, quiet and pale, offered a smile so rehearsed it may have been borrowed. Her father, Sir John, lingered by the mantel as if measuring exits. Adrian Chiddart was late, and already drinking by the time he arrived. His laugh had become a defence, and his reputation a shadow of what it once was. Studholme had written the review that ended Adrian's career, calling his last play an insult to firewood. That line alone had cost him 2 publishers, 1 tour, and nearly his marriage. And yet, here he was, invited, watching. Everyone had come with a secret, but only Studholme knew which ones were valuable. As they dined, he directed the conversation with invisible threads, guiding the guests through topics of loyalty, disgrace, inheritance, and justice, always brushing close to some unspoken truth, never quite touching it. Joan said almost nothing. Adrian said too much. Amelia, always poised, asked the table whether the British considered blackmail a tradition or merely a sport. No one answered. At one point, General Piddinghoe excused himself for nearly a quarter of an hour. When he returned, he looked as if something had shifted inside him. Studholme said nothing, but tapped twice on his wine glass, once as acknowledgement, once as warning. Even the butler, discreet and well-trained, seemed unsettled. He poured the wine with a hand too steady, as if overcompensating. There had been whispers among the staff about a letter gone missing, about a cover-up involving someone from the Foreign Office. None of it confirmed, but all of it possible. As dessert was served and the rain tapped quietly against the penthouse windows, the room settled into something colder than comfort. The quartet had stopped playing. There was no more music, and no one noticed, because by then conversation had given way to silence, not the peaceful kind, the kind that listens, the kind that waits. There was no announcement, no instruction, but each guest understood something was about to begin. And when Princess Amelia, with that slow, deliberate smile, lifted her empty glass and said, "Shall we play a game?" no one laughed, because they all knew, whether they admitted it or not, that the game had already begun, long before the first invitation was ever delivered, and it would end, not with applause, but with confession.
Chapter 3. The guests step forward. And so the room, caught between dessert and consequence, took a breath it would not exhale again for some time. The string quartet had gone silent. The laughter, once orchestrated like a rehearsed overture, had decayed into hesitant glances and clinking glasses. They were no longer attendees of a party. They were pieces on a board, deliberately placed, unwittingly surrounded. The penthouse itself did little to soften the mood. It loomed as only wealth can, its quietly, deliberately, without apology. The marble underfoot was imported, cold enough to echo even the softest heel. Oil portraits lined the walls, none of them sentimental. The chandeliers, suspended like accusations overhead, glittered not with warmth but with power, curated not to impress but to intimidate. No corner of the room was free from intent, and into this gilded pressure chamber they arrived. Joan Holland, the first to cross the threshold, stepped inside with the caution of someone entering a confession rather than a party. She wore navy, elegant, severe, and carried no handbag. Her face, though composed, had the faint rigidity of someone who had memorized lines she hoped not to speak. Her father, Sir John, entered moments later. He was not introduced. He didn't need to be. His presence alone was a kind of authority, quiet, unyielding, already taking notes no one had asked for. Guy Kenyon was next. Hair still damp from the mist, expression unreadable, he handed his coat to the butler without a word. He did not greet his wife, who arrived minutes after him. Peggy Studholme, born into the walls of this house, walked in as though she knew precisely how many cracks had been painted over. Her posture was immaculate, but her gaze, that betrayed a rage so precisely disguised it looked almost serene. Then came Adrian Chidiot. His arrival was not late, but it wanted to be. He moved with theatrical hesitation, as if waiting to be asked why he had come at all. His hand gripped a cane he didn't require, and his mouth offered smiles that did not trust themselves. Anna followed, pale as frost, her voice barely louder than the rustle of her dress. Princess Amelia arrived last, not because she wished to be admired, but because she expected to be missed. She offered no explanation for the toy pistol tucked visibly into her handbag. When asked, she merely smiled and said, "One never knows." Her gown shimmered with imported defiance. Her accent wandered, her glances lingered, and every word she offered sounded like it had been approved by 3 governments before leaving her mouth. And then he appeared. Lord Malcolm Studholme did not enter. He emerged. From the staircase above, composed in silhouette until the final step, he moved as a man who knew everything in the room already belonged to him. He paused just long enough for every gaze to land where it should. He did not speak at first, only observed, as if waiting for someone to blink, to falter, to confess by accident, and none of them did. Not yet. Studholme did not welcome them in the traditional sense. He moved through the room like a surveyor, rather than a host, noting who stood too close, who drank too little, who avoided whose gaze. His presence carried no warmth, only pressure, refined and silent, like a door that closes slowly but locks absolutely. He greeted Joan Holland first, but only in proximity. "Navy suits you," he murmured, as if the compliment were evidence. She nodded stiffly, then glanced toward her father. Sir John met Studholme's gaze with the blank restraint of a man who has already made up his mind about a man he cannot yet confront. To Guy, Studholme extended a hand, but not a smile. "Still employed, are we?" he said, as though the position might have expired in the hours before arrival. "For now," Guy replied, matching his tone, though his jaw set tighter than usual. The 2 men stood for a moment, not talking, merely measuring each other's ability to remain silent. Peggy intervened with the timing of someone who has done so before. "We didn't come to be tested," she said, and her father turned to her with an expression too polite to be genuine. "My dear," he replied, "you've misunderstood. You've already failed." She did not flinch. Studholme moved on. Anna and Adrian Chidiot stood apart from the others, not quite mingling, not quite excluded. Adrian sipped his brandy and watched the host circle his own party like a hawk selecting rabbits. "You know," Adrian said softly to no one in particular, "if this were fiction, the obvious man would be the first to fall." His wife said nothing. Her eyes remained on her hands. Studholme approached Adrian slowly, like an actor awaiting a cue. "Still writing?" he asked, lacing the question with venom disguised as civility. "Still publishing?" Adrian countered. "Or just blackmailing in italics now?" The pause that followed held weight. Studholme's smile didn't move. "I hear you're working on a new piece," he said. "I'm told it opens with a lie." Adrian raised his glass in mock salute. "So does the Telegraph." Elsewhere, Princess Amelia had drawn attention without asking for it. She stood near the fireplace, absent-mindedly examining her pistol, silver ornamental, meant for display but disturbingly real in her hands. "It was a gift," she said to no one in particular, "from a very small man who believed I needed protection." When Studholme approached her, he did not mention the weapon. He merely looked at it, then at her. "Planning to declare war?" he asked. Amelia smiled. "Only if I find myself surrounded." The guests laughed, thinly, uneasily, but no one responded, because nothing seemed out of place until it suddenly was, and already the evening had begun collecting its debts. The clock in the hallway struck 9, though no one looked toward it. The sound was ceremonial, unacknowledged, yet observed by all. Conversations had begun to lose their form, now shaped more by implication than content. Glances lasted a breath too long, compliments folded under lies. It was then, with the orchestra preparing to resume,
that Studholme took his place near the window, overlooking a rain-glazed London below, and called for silence, not with voice but with stillness. The room responded. He turned, slowly, and said, "To secrets, may they never be safe." A toast, unrecorded but remembered. And just like that, the room exhaled, though not in relief. It was a signal. The gloves, so to speak, had been removed. He beckoned Joan Holland forward with a gentle tilt of the head. She obeyed, as one might a verdict. They spoke in low tones, at least at first, but across the room Sir John straightened, his posture no longer social, but paternal. Studholme's voice, too measured to carry, was clearly cutting into something sensitive. Joan's shoulders tensed, her replies shortened. He mentioned the letters, though not by name. She replied with a refusal, though not aloud, and whatever power she had hoped would shield her dissolved in the space between their shoes. Her gaze darted to her father, but Sir John did not yet intervene. Elsewhere, Peggy and Guy were cornered. The marriage, kept secret until now, was no longer safe. Studholme had known for days. He saved the confrontation for dessert. "You've made your choice," he told her, "which means I'm free to make mine." Guy stepped forward, but Studholme ignored him. "You may have her name," he said, "but you'll never have my favour, and without that you'll be nothing but a footnote." Peggy's voice did not rise. "Then strike my name from your records," she said. "We have no use for favours bought with silence." The room did not react, but Anna, in the corner, closed her eyes. Adrian Chidderwood, leaning against the piano, chose that moment to interject. "You know, Malcolm, the only thing more fragile than a secret," he said, "is the man who uses them for sport." Studholme turned with the grace of a guillotine. "Then be careful what you hide," he replied, "or I may decide you're no longer entertaining." Adrian said nothing, but his eyes remained locked on the man who had once destroyed his reputation with a single review, and now threatened to finish what he'd begun. The silence that followed was not empty, it was watching. And then, Amelia, the princess, watching from her perch on the arm of an overstuffed chair, lifted her glass, not to toast but to interrupt. "If we're done trading grievances," she said, "shall we play something? A game, perhaps, one with rules, or none at all." She reached into her purse, and with the precision of performance, withdrew the small silver pistol. "Let us pretend," she added, "just for a moment, that anyone here is truly innocent." No one objected. No one laughed, because in that moment, they all knew what she was proposing wasn't a distraction. It was a mirror, and it would end in blood.
Chapter 4. The game begins. No one moved. Not out of fear, but out of etiquette. For even in moments of high tension, the elite do not flinch. They assess, they weigh, and then they adapt. The princess's suggestion lingered in the air longer than any toast had. It had the shape of a joke, but none of its ingredients. Her pistol remained in her hand, not pointed, not raised, but present, like a punctuation mark for a sentence that had yet to be spoken aloud. Lord Studholme, who ordinarily would have reclaimed control of the room with a glare or a subtle insult, said nothing. His eyes narrowed slightly. That was all. It was Adrian Chidderwood who broke the silence. "If we are to play murder, let's at least do it properly," he said, reaching for a fountain pen and tearing a few pages from his pocket notebook. His hands moved quickly, too quickly, as though the familiarity of fiction comforted him more than the reality of the room. One detective, one murderer, the rest of us, pawns to be eliminated or interrogated at will. His voice danced at the edge of sarcasm, but no one challenged him. Studholme offered a single nod. "Distribute the rolls. Let's have it." The slips were folded, shuffled, drawn, eyes flicked down, then up again, some too quickly, others too slowly. Then, as if on cue, the lights dimmed, not extinguished, not entirely, but enough to soften identities and deepen uncertainties. No one protested, because to protest would be to acknowledge the stakes. For a moment, there was stillness, then the room breathed again, but not as it had before. There were footsteps, quiet ones, moving with caution, not purpose. A clink of glass against wood, the hiss of silk brushing against the back of a chair. Someone, perhaps the princess, let out a faint laugh, though it was the kind made for distraction, not humour. In the shadows, voices began to stir. Joan, voice hushed and urgent, spoke into the dark. "I didn't want to bring them," she whispered. "He made me." There was no reply, just the creak of someone leaning closer. "Father," she added, softer now. "He has the letters. I never meant for you to find out like this." A breath. Sir John's perhaps, but still, no answer. Elsewhere, Guy Kenyon moved with calculated steps. He had drawn nothing special, but he played his role, perhaps too well. He passed through the archway into the study, where he knew Studholme might be alone. He reached for the man's shoulder, not aggressively, not yet. A tap, like the rules dictated, but the chair was already turning, and in that same breath, Adrian was gone. No footsteps had marked his departure. No voice had trailed behind him. He had been by the piano, then he wasn't. Another step, a pause, and then something sharper, not a sound one expected from a parlour game. Something more immediate, something final. Then, a second sound, faster, louder, followed by stillness. And just before the lights returned, a single whisper was heard, clearer than the rest. There was supposed to be only one. The lights did not flicker. They returned, cleanly, with no announcement, as if the house, indifferent to what had just occurred, resumed its usual schedule without apology. But the room had changed. Lord Malcolm Studholme, host, manipulator, kingmaker, now sat slumped in the leather armchair of his private study. His hand rested awkwardly on the armrest, one button of his waistcoat undone, and the faintest trace of red at the edge of his collar. A second mark, lower, near the ribs. His spectacles remained perfectly in place, though the expression behind them had gone entirely. At his feet lay the toy gun, silver, ornate, out of place. For a moment no one moved. Not the princess, who stood beside the mantel, glass still in hand. Not Joan, who stared into the space where her father had stood only moments before. Not Adrian, who had returned as suddenly as he had vanished, now seated with a calm too deliberate to be convincing. It was Anna who reached first for the light switch, then stopped. Her hand hovered, then dropped, as if deciding not to reset something that had clearly passed the point of return. Sir John stepped forward, not as a father, but as a detective. He approached slowly, bending down beside the chair. His hand, practiced and steady, checked for breath, for pulse, for any sign of animation. What he found or did not find, he did not say aloud, but his jaw clenched slightly, and when he rose, it was with a weight behind his eyes that had not been there moments before. "The game is over," he said, and with that, the room exhaled. Questions came next, not orderly, not rational, but sharp, urgent, nearly colliding. "Is this part of it? Is he pretending? Where is the butler? Who fired? I heard one. No, two." Amelia raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She stepped forward and nudged the toy gun with the toe of her heel. "Harmless," she murmured, "mine's never been loaded." But the words felt hollow, decorative, like a frame around a painting no one wanted to see. Peggy turned to Guy. "You went after him," she said, voice clipped. "You followed." Guy didn't answer. "Not at first. I tapped him on the shoulder," he said finally. "Just as we agreed." He turned around. "That's all I remember." Adrian stood now. "We all heard two," he said. "Two distinct sounds. That was no theatrical flourish." He looked toward the floor. "That was a gunshot. Twice." Joan's voice cracked. "There was a second, after the first one. Closer, or louder. I'm not sure." No one knew where the real weapon had gone, but everyone knew it had been in the room, because the toy pistol was still here, neatly placed, untouched by anything but the weight of speculation. And yet, Studholme had been shot. Twice, once from close range, once from somewhere else. Studholme remained where he had fallen. His power, once absolute, had vanished into silence, and in its place stood doubt, tall, still, fully dressed. The room did not empty. It recoiled. Conversations pulled inward.
Trust disintegrated in real time. No one looked directly at the others for long. To speak now was to risk implication. To stay silent, equally so. The butler was found moments later in the lower stairwell, shaken, not from what he had seen, but from what he had heard. He had been dismissed early, a decision, he said, that had not come from Studholme. That detail mattered. It was logged mentally by Sir John, though not shared. Joan sat quietly on the edge of the chaise lounge, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes somewhere else. She had spoken too much in the dark, too openly, to the wrong man, or the right one, and now her secrets were shared, no longer held hostage but exposed. Peggy and Guy stood apart. She watched the body, he watched the room. His coat remained on, as if he might still leave, but his shoes told another story, wet from the terrace, unexplained. Adrian, ever theatrical, kept his voice low and his posture alert. Whoever did this, he said, did it with time to plan. The second shot wasn't a panic. It was a correction. He looked at Studholme's chair. The first wasn't enough. Sir John didn't answer, but his glance toward the princess was not casual. She had returned to her perch, entirely composed. She polished the edge of her glass with her thumb. When she noticed his stare, she raised one eyebrow and said, "I never liked games with rules." That left only Anna, who sat beside the fire, staring not into the flames, but past them. Her lips moved once, a name perhaps, or a prayer. The real weapon was never found in the open, but powder residue had begun to settle, on cuffs, on sleeves, in corners, and then there were the slips of paper, now recovered. The murderer had been assigned to Guy, the detective, to Adrian, but both claimed ignorance, of role, of expectation, of outcome. Sir John looked again at the study door, now ajar. He took one step toward it, stopped, looked back at the room. 12 guests, one body, but more than one motive, more than one opportunity, and far, far more than one lie, because what lay before them was not the resolution of a parlor game, but the beginning of something far more dangerous. One man was gone, but every guest held a weapon of their own. Motive. Where are you watching from? And what, if anything, do you believe can provide justice for this violence? Subscribe to follow the trial, the testimonies, and the twist that still waits behind the final act.
Chapter 5. The Gathering Cracks. The body had not been moved. Not yet. In the corner of the drawing room, a clock ticked steadily, as if unaware of its sudden elevation from background hum to unnerving punctuation. The guests were held in a kind of suspended arrangement, each one orbiting the empty centre of power, now left behind by Lord Malcolm Studholme. And then came the knock. Firm, unapologetic. 3 measured raps that broke the tension, but offered no comfort. Inspector Albert Ramage stepped into the penthouse with the air of a man who did not care whose rug he was walking on. He carried a notepad, a hat still beaded with rain, and a particular look in his eye, that of a man who had not been born into this world of cut crystal and foreign cigars, but had long since learned how to hold his ground within it. He did not greet the princess. He did not pause for a drink. He made a straight line for the study, and when he returned, the silence around him was different, no longer stunned, now coiled. "Ladies, gentlemen, we'll need your patience this evening, and your honesty, 2 qualities, of course, in very short supply." He began not with the loudest, but with the nearest. Guy Kenyon, secretary, husband, the last man to follow Studholme into the dark. "We spoke, briefly. He was alive when I tapped him," Guy said. "Then the lights returned, and he was like that." "Did you fire a weapon?" "No," Guy said quickly, too quickly. Ramage did not respond. Next, Joan Holland, pale, elegant, clutching her gloves like a verdict. "I heard a shot, then another," she said. "There were voices, one close to me, one further off. I told someone something. I thought it was my father." Her voice faltered. Inspector Ramage looked at Sir John, whose own reply came not in speech, but in a simple incline of the head. Careful, neutral, unreadable. "You're a detective, sir," Ramage said. "I am," replied Sir John, and I was a guest tonight, nothing more. And your daughter, she had reasons to be afraid, but not reasons to fire a weapon. It was a statement meant to deflect, not deny. Raymage noted it. Then, Adrian Chidiot returned from somewhere. No alibi, only wit. I was the detective in the game, he said, almost smiling. How ironic. Where did you go when the lights went out? I went looking for irony, and found silence. No one saw you. No one ever sees the writer, Adrian said, until the last chapter. Raymage turned to Amelia, who shrugged. It was a party, she said, and a foolish one. I assumed the sound was theatrical. If not, well, someone clearly didn't appreciate the entertainment. Her indifference was either authentic or perfectly rehearsed. But the question hung in the air like perfume. Who knew the plan, and who improvised? No one had left the penthouse. That was Raymage's first rule. The door stays shut. No phones, no messages, no lawyers. Not yet. The room was no longer a salon. It was a container, one that now echoed with restrained voices and nervous glances. Each guest no longer spoke as themselves, but as the version of themselves they wished to be seen as. Rehearsed, rewritten, and then came General Piddinghoe. He stepped forward with a kind of noble gravity, his military posture unwavering, his eyes dry and direct. He cleared his throat, not for attention, but for control. I must confess, he said, it was me. The sound you heard was mine. I panicked. There was a weapon. I found it, and I used it. The man insulted a lady. I acted on instinct. The room did not respond with gasps, as he perhaps expected. It responded with pause. Even Inspector Raymage, who had spent a career peeling apart guilt from performance, raised an eyebrow, but not in agreement. What kind of weapon, General? A revolver. Where is it now? I discarded it. Where? Piddinghoe hesitated. I forget. A breathless second passed. Raymage scribbled nothing. You forget where you threw a firearm? He asked calmly. I was in a state of rage, said the General. Not regret. That too. The confession was clean. Yes, but too convenient. Too clean. Studholme had held power over many, but none more than those who believed in honor and hierarchy. The General had motive, but his explanation had none of the marks that truth leaves behind. Later that night, Sir John Holland moved alone through the guest chambers, unseen by Raymage, not as a detective, and not entirely as a father, but as something in between. He entered the study, the desk, still littered with notes, correspondence, threats left unsigned, and secrets never meant to surface. Among them, a thin envelope, Joan's name. Inside, the letters, all of them, ink pressed into confession, vulnerability, inked into scandal. He did not hesitate. He opened the fireplace, and one by one, he fed the letters to the flame. The smoke lifted, silent and absolute, no audience, no applause, just ashes. By morning, the toy gun had vanished. No one admitted to touching it. Some claimed it had never been there at all. Amelia said she remembered the sound, but not the sequence. Adrian said perhaps the weapon was only metaphor. Joan said nothing. Guy denied everything, and yet said too much. Sir John's expression never changed, but Inspector Raymage's resolve did, and by nightfall, he made his decision. Guy Kenyon was placed under arrest. Motive, humiliation, opportunity, proximity, means uncertain, but the handcuffs closed nonetheless. Yet, one voice, in the quiet, whispered what several had begun to feel. He didn't do it. The rain had not stopped. It tapped against the tall glass of the penthouse windows like it too demanded entry. But inside, nothing moved. Guy Kenyon stood at the center of the room, flanked not by allies, but by stares. Some curious, some reluctant. One from Peggy, entirely unreadable. Inspector Raymage read the charge: unlawful possession, suspicion of involvement, conspiracy to mislead. The language was cold, polished, neutral. Guy did not argue. He only looked to his wife, and then down at his hands, as if realizing too late how very little power they had ever held. Sir John said nothing.
He watched the arrest with the quiet of a man who understood what it meant to protect a family, not by shouting, but by sacrificing. And yet his gaze lingered not on Guy, but on Chidiot, who stood just beyond the hearth, smiling faintly to himself. It was not a smile of satisfaction, nor of justice, but of a man watching a play reach Act 3 and waiting to see if the script would stick to its cues. Elsewhere, Joan pressed her back to the velvet of a high-backed chair, as if trying to disappear into the upholstery. She had not spoken since dawn, when she had learned the letters were gone. She had not asked where they went. She didn't need to. And perhaps it was that silence, so complete, that gave her more power now than she had the night before. Secrets exposed. Yes, but no longer in someone else's hands. Amelia crossed her legs and commented idly on the way justice was peculiar in English drawing rooms. When asked if she would remain in London, she answered with a shrug. Perhaps, she said, the entertainment has... By midday the guests had begun to leave. Not dismissed, simply unravelling like the final guests at a party that had lasted too long, but not Sir John, and not Adrienne. One stayed to protect, the other to observe, and when Inspector Ramage returned to the study, now emptied of body and blood and bourbon glasses, he sat for the first time. He placed the case file on the table, and paused. There were 2 bullets, one close range, one distant, 2 gunshots, 2 possible hands. But only one arrest. He did not believe in neat endings, nor did he trust performances, and as he sat there turning a fountain pen slowly between his fingers, he said aloud, not for anyone else, but for the silence, "There is a second confession still waiting." He did not yet know who would deliver it, only that it would arrive too late, or precisely on time, and perhaps with another consequence entirely. The truth was close, but not close enough, and not everyone was convinced the right man was behind bars.
Chapter 6. Courtroom in Crimson. The courtroom was colder than the penthouse had ever been, and yet, paradoxically, it crackled with more heat. Heated whispers in polished wood and hushed gasps from gallery seats. Justice was meant to be blind, yet here, beneath high windows and stern portraits, she watched with undeniable awareness, as if every spectator carried a secret in their hearts. Guy Kenyon sat in the dock. His suit, once polished, was rumpled now by a night of uncertainty. He had been silent since his arrest, but the eyes, clear, unwavering, revealed more than his words could. His proximity to Lord Studholme at the fatal moment, his attempt to follow rules that had ended in tragedy, all weighed heavily. Yet his face bore no guilt, only questions. Inside, the courtroom smelled of ink and regret, black print evidence laid bare on tables, photos of the penthouse strewn like invitations to despair. Inspector Ramage paced before the jury, delivering details that tightened the narrative, each point a twist reinforcing the case, the 2 shots, the missing weapon, Guy's proximity. The room absorbed every syllable, every ounce of evidence, every hint of motive. A man humiliated, a man cornered. The ingredients of revenge, tinged with desperation. "You were last seen with the host," the barrister said, voice laced with accusation. "You had reasons to feel betrayed, to suffer in obscurity while your wife lived under his roof. You had the means." His tone ended in a challenge. Guy raised his head. "I tapped him as agreed," he said calmly. "I didn't threaten, I didn't hold a weapon, I only followed the rules." Rules, the barrister spat, which led to gunshots. Behind Guy, Peggy sat with her hands clasped together, knuckles white. Her lips moved slightly in silent hopes. Her eyes found her father, Sir John, watching from the back row, an unreadable mask on his face, as if he carried not only confession, but also the weight of a father's obsession with protecting his child. Then came Sir John's moment. He rose, adjusted his collar, and walked to the witness stand. The courtroom quieted, respect meeting weariness, as if his presence held the authority to tilt verdicts. No man in that room had more to lose, or more to protect. I loved Malcolm Studholme as a man of influence. He paused, steady, but he misused that influence. He demanded obedience. He manipulated secrets, blackmailed reputations, traded on fears. He looked at Guy, at Peggy, then addressed the jury. I deceived no one when I said my daughter's husband had no part in murder, but I lied when I said I could not have done it myself. He inhaled deeply. If my daughter dies ruined, I will tell you, I would confess to a crime I did not commit to protect her. Shock rippled. The barrister rose to object. Sir John allowed it. He was not finished. My guilt lies not in that chair, he said, but in the fear that drove me here, and I confess to that fear, not to murder. The gavel dropped softly. The spectators exhaled. Guy's trial teetered on a knife edge. Sir John stood down, pallid but resolute. The prosecution stumbled to regroup. Yet before they could refocus, a disturbance erupted near the back doors. Adrian Chidiot burst forward, eyes wild, coat flying. In his hand gleamed a revolver. Not the toy pistol from the penthouse, but real, polished metal that glinted under the chandelier's light. Every breath halted, every thought stalled. He placed the weapon on the desk before him, near the stunned barrister and the silent judge. Then he began his monologue. There was a stillness in the air that did not belong to fear, nor reverence. It was the stillness of history waiting to be written. Adrian Chidiot did not raise the gun, at least not yet. He placed it before him like an offering, a final punctuation to a life lived under the heel of another man's ink. Then slowly, deliberately, he turned toward the judge, the jury, the gallery, and finally the dock. His voice did not tremble. It arrived instead with clarity, a writer's cadence, sharpened by rage long suppressed. He destroyed me with a paragraph, Chidiot began. Not with facts, not with truth, but with manipulation, whispered suggestions, artful lies penned in an editorial no longer traceable to any editor. He called it journalism. I called it the end of my reputation, and now I ask you. He leaned closer. What is a man supposed to do when stripped of everything by another's pen? A murmur rose and died again. Chidiot lifted the revolver, not to aim, but to present, like a relic from a ritual. He wielded words. I wielded this. One writes history, the other corrects it. Gasps. The judge called for calm. The guards edged forward, but no one dared interrupt. Even the wood of the room seemed to listen. Chidiot turned to the gallery. You all believe this trial is about justice, but it is not. This is about power, the kind that does not wear a crown, but controls the ones who do. Lord Studholme did not destroy reputations by mistake. He curated them, cultivated scandal, provoked confession, exploited secrets until they bled. He walked slowly toward Guy. You are not the accused here. You are the placeholder, a distraction. Guy didn't move, nor did Peggy. She clutched the bench like it might disappear. Then Chidiot's voice cracked for the first time, not from weakness, but from memory. He printed my betrayal before I understood it. He rewrote my affair into fiction, then burned my livelihood to the ground. He offered no apology, only a footnote. A source confirms. He looked toward the judge, eyes ablaze. He ended my life with a pen. I returned the favor with lead. Before anyone could react, before a breath could warn, a word could plead, he lifted the gun toward the ceiling and pulled the trigger. Gunshot. A crack of thunder inside a cathedral. Screams. Shouts. Guards moved. The judge ducked, but no one was hurt. Not yet. Chidiot, standing tall amidst chaos, lifted the revolver once more, not to aim, but to speak. And now, his voice steadied for the final time. Let the ink dry on that, Lord Studholme. And without ceremony, he turned the gun on himself and fired. The courtroom shattered. A woman screamed. The guards surged forward. The gallery erupted in confusion. The polished civility of the trial tearing apart like paper in the rain. Peggy wept, cradled by her father. Guy stood stunned, neither free nor condemned, merely suspended in a silence far louder than any verdict. Amelia whispered something no one caught. Sir John held his daughter as though it were the only act left he could perform. The judge called order, but order had left the room. Somewhere beneath the chaos, beneath the rising fog of truth and illusion, the question still lingered, unspoken but undeniable. Was this justice, or merely another confession, written in smoke? There are moments when the world forgets how to breathe. The court sat suspended in the dust of gunpowder and disbelief.
It's silence, not emptiness, but observation. Something had shifted, not just in the air, but in the direction of guilt. Guy Kenyon was no longer on trial, not truly. His charges remained, yes, and his name still appeared on the docket, but every eye now flickered elsewhere, toward the bench, toward the judge, toward a system that had allowed power to bleed without accountability until it was forced to confess through gunfire. Chidiott's body was removed within the hour. The revolver, still warm, rested beneath a hand once skilled at writing satires sharper than the scalpel. The man who once inked society's secrets now lay sprawled beneath its weight, a final confession offered without expectation of justice. Sir John Winthrop, pale yet composed, requested to speak. The judge hesitated, then allowed it. John rose, walked to the center, and paused as though adjusting the script of a performance he had rehearsed 1,000 times, and still found unbearable. "My lord," he began, "this trial was never about a single shot. It was about silence, about what we allow to pass when truth is inconvenient. I burned the letters. That was no accident. I did so to protect a legacy. Mine, my daughter's, and yes, even Lord Studholme's." A murmur passed through the gallery. He continued, "I do not excuse what I did, nor do I believe Mr. Kenyon is innocent of everything. But I believe the manipulations of this room run deeper than any one witness can name. And I ask, no, I beg, that this court weigh those lies, those cover-ups, as heavily as it weighs any gunshot." He stepped down. No applause, no outrage, just that heavy, heavy silence again, watching. When the jury recessed, they took longer than expected. When they returned, they did not deliver a verdict. Instead, they requested time to re-examine the statements in light of new testimony. The judge granted the motion, and so Guy was led not to a cell, but to a holding chamber, neither free nor condemned. As the court emptied, Peggy stood alone in the gallery, staring at the brass plate on the defense bench. She traced it once with her glove, then left without a word. Amelia vanished. Whether she returned to her embassy or her country, no one quite knew. Sir John returned home, locked his study, and was not seen again for 3 days. And in the press, no editorial was printed about Chidiott. No photograph ran. Just a single column note beneath the society page. Courtroom incident delays verdict in Studholme case. Further details pending. That was all, except for one anonymous letter sent to the press. 7 words, typed. "Justice isn't blind, it's just well dressed." There was no signature, no one claimed it. But among those who had been present, not one failed to understand the weight of what had been lost, or how very close they had come to losing something else entirely. A fatal game, once played in jest, had now claimed more than reputation. It had claimed silence, and silence, once disturbed, never returns quite the same.
Chapter 7. The Silence After Applause. In the days that followed the trial, no confetti fell from rooftops, and no banner of triumph was unfurled. London moved forward as it always did, with its polished shoes and muffled whispers, with its tailored diplomacy and its artful silence. But within certain corridors, behind expensive curtains and guarded drawing rooms, the air had changed, permanently. The Studholme Empire, so monolithic just months before, fractured not with protest but with quiet exodus. Board members resigned discreetly. His newspaper group rebranded itself with neutral colours and softer headlines. Columns once rich in scandal and suggestion now favoured finance, weather and crossword puzzles. But reputation once bent does not return to form. It hardens into something colder, something that no longer listens. The penthouse remained untouched. No heirs came forward to claim it. No auctions were announced. The velvet chairs still bore the indentations of conversations that could no longer be repeated. A half-empty decanter still rested on the sideboard beside the crystal glasses never washed. No more parties, no more power games, no more performances. The city had moved on, but its silence had grown. Observant, Princess Amelia returned to a kingdom drowning in debt and diplomatic embarrassment. Her glamour, once weaponized to charm ambassadors and publishers alike, now proved powerless against creditors and parliamentarians. A brief headline, "Continental Royal Faces National Cuts," appeared in the foreign papers, and then nothing. She was seen last boarding a train, without escort. Joan Langford was more decisive. 3 weeks after the trial concluded, she vacated her Belgravia flat. No forwarding address. Some said she'd taken a job with a French literary house. Others whispered she'd crossed the Atlantic. No one was certain. Only one thing was beyond doubt. She had left the country as efficiently as she had once exposed it. And with her departure went the last of the letters. Those whispered levers of influence that had shaken even Sir John. Ah yes, Sir John. The diplomat, once unimpeachable, now walked with a slight stoop, not physical, but reputational. He retired shortly thereafter, citing exhaustion. Those closest to him noted how often he sat in his study, door closed, fire unlit. No memoir was written, no portrait hung, just long hours with untended tea, and a silence that one suspects asked more questions than he'd ever answered. And what of Guy and Peggy? They withdrew, quite naturally, quite quietly. A small house in Dorset, a larger garden than necessary, the occasional newspaper photo of them at some local fete, always smiling, always gracious. But the eyes told a different story, one of restraint, of memory, of a bargain made in court and paid for in private. The trial was over, but the guilt, guilt is no respecter of verdicts, and so the city moved, the headlines changed, and time, polite as always, began to cover over the names etched into public discourse, like they had always belonged to someone else. Yet the penthouse remained, unclaimed, untouched, and on one unremarkable evening, as the fog descended and the lamps flickered across Mayfair's polished streets, a single light returned to that once celebrated address. A maintenance man, perhaps, a broker, a ghost, we do not know, only this: the rain fell again, and this time, no one danced beneath it. Justice, when seen through the eyes of the public, often wears a robe, holds a gavel, and delivers a verdict with satisfying finality. But in this particular tale, wrapped as it was in scandal, power, and secrets exposed, justice arrived not with applause, but with ambiguity, and so the city was left to interpret the silence. The trial had closed its doors. The public, though ravenous, received only fragments, no statement from the Crown, no clarification from the Ministry, just the sudden halt of a once sympathetic narrative. And in that void, whispers returned more vivid than testimony, more dangerous than fact. Some believed CINAMATIC was a lone man, driven by rage, a casualty of corruption, the embodiment of revenge, shaped not by weapon, but by humiliation. Others, quieter still, suspected something deeper, that his final act was not a confession, but a distraction, because one question remained unresolved: who had given him access to the courtroom? Such doors do not open by accident. In one wing of the inner temple, where legal records sleep in walnut drawers, a junior clerk found a transfer slip that never should have existed, a signature scratched, not written, a name misfiled, a paper trail, deliberately shortened, and still, no one spoke aloud what they feared most, that CINAMATIC had help from within. That is how legacies falter, not in collapse, but in the quiet reclassification of loyalty. Elsewhere, the Studholme Foundation, once Europe's loudest cultural benefactor, ceased operations. Exhibitions closed, grants paused, a final audit cited resource exhaustion. But the wiser among the staff knew it was not exhaustion, but contamination. The family name, once a passport to elite circles, now resembled a warning label, an invitation to scandal. And even as the upper crust of society outwardly returned to its symphonies, soirees and public handshakes, subtle dislocations appeared. Friendships thinned, investments hesitated, hostesses reconsidered their guest lists. Men who had once shaken Lord Studholme's hand now glanced behind them before saying so. The memory of the trial, the gunshots, the confession, still lingered in every raised glass, every half-smile, every clipped headline. One club in St. James's reportedly banned the word penthouse entirely, not out of reverence, out of fear, because in private, even the most confident among them had begun to ask the question no one dared say aloud in court: was Guy truly guilty of the murder? His fingerprints had never been found on the weapon. His voice, though strained, had never changed. His love for Peggy, though strained by betrayal, had not once fractured.
And yet his presence at the scene, his access, his silence, it all fit too well, too quickly, and yet, not quite right. There was one truth left unspoken, murmured an unnamed barrister during a luncheon, and it was waiting for her. Who the her referred to, he would not say. Perhaps he meant Peggy, perhaps not. The silence wasn't empty. It was watching. And so the story that began in champagne and velvet ended not in verdicts or headlines, but in absence. No memorial was ever held for Lord Malcolm Studholme, not by the press, not by Parliament, not even by the socialites who once clung to his coattails. It was as though his name, once spoken with either awe or fear, had been pulled from the language by invisible hands. That was the final act of power, not remembrance, but erasure. The penthouse overlooking Hyde Park remained unsold. Potential buyers withdrew, citing structural issues, though none existed. Agents changed firms, listings expired. Its rooms, still lined with books, artifacts and the echoes of confrontation, became something else entirely, a monument to a game no one ever truly won. The game had been fatal, and every player, in their own quiet way, had lost something that could not be bought back. Sir John, once respected for diplomacy, was now remembered only for his silence during trial. His final public words were brief. There are things the law does not reach, but that does not make them less real. He retired to the coast, alone. Joan Langford's manuscripts were never published. The publishing house quietly denied they had received them. Her name faded from the salons she once scandalized. Her letters, so central, so feared, remained unverified, unread, and perhaps forever unseen. Princess Amelia's exile continued, a name in the ledger of failed monarchies, a footnote with jewels no longer worn. And as for Guy and Peggy, they became a kind of myth, seen rarely, spoken of more often. Their love, once secret, once endangered, became their sanctuary. The world had moved on, but some wounds do not close. They bury themselves quietly beneath gestures of domesticity, under the tending of roses, behind shut windows. In the end, it was not the courtroom that delivered justice, nor the press, nor the whispers. It was time, time with its peculiar way of selecting what deserves legacy and what deserves forgetting. And yet, as the final shot of this story draws our gaze upward to that penthouse window still intact, still lit by the same electric chandelier, a shape passes by. No face, no movement to be recorded, just a sense that the room is not as empty as it claims. There are no more suspects, no more witnesses, only consequences, and the faintest impression that truth has not yet spoken its final word. The party was over, but its echoes, those echoes would haunt London's elite for years to come. Chapter 8, the final curtain. And now, with the echoes faded, and every corridor of Studholme's kingdom sealed or silenced, we are left with a single, lingering question, one that no trial, no confession, no funeral ever truly answered. Was justice served, or merely delayed? It is tempting to assign blame, to seize upon a verdict, a gunshot, a witness who spoke too soon, or far too late. But within these walls, truth was rarely delivered directly. It arrived twisted through power, whispered through betrayal, buried beneath confession that came too late to absolve. Perhaps the greatest deception was not in the lies spoken aloud, but in the truths no one dared voice. Now it is your turn. Who would you have suspected? Was it Joan, with her vanished letters and rising desperation? Was it Chidiet, whose final monologue rattled a courtroom to silence? Or did the real answer lie within the very walls of that penthouse, disguised in velvet and varnish? Comment below where you're watching from and what you believe would truly provide justice for such violence. And if this twisted tale kept you held until the very end, then wait until you hear about the fall of Sir Regis Delacroix in 1936, a man who knew every secret in Parliament, except the one that destroyed him. Until next time, stay sharp. The silence isn't always empty.